Hey there, Tony here from Chronoforge Studios. In today's devlog, I'm going to be bringing you up to speed on what I've been working on, which engine I started with, which one I ended up going with ultimately, and why I made that choice. I'm going to be breaking up this video into two parts to make the length a little more reasonable. I'll also be testing different methods to shoot my logs to make it as efficient as possible to both create and edit them. So you might see things change from time to time as my process evolves. I want to find a good balance between covering my process enough and actually having enough time to develop the game. At the end of the day, my goal is to create a video game, so I'm going to do my best to cover my process, but my priority does have to be to get that out there, because eventually it does have to release. There's a lot that goes into deciding what game you're going to make, and what the best tools will be to make it. It can vary quite a bit depending on what your goals are, and what the experience you and your team have. The perspective I give through my devlogs will focus mainly on my goals, which is to create an indie game studio as a sustainable business, and my personal experience as both a programmer and an artist. That being said, I'll try to highlight different backgrounds, perspectives, and goals to try to give a full picture of what my thought process would be if I was in those situations. Up until very recently, I was a Unity guy through and through. I spent many years working as a developer in Unity, and I knew it quite well. I've released 2 games using Unity. The first was a mobile game that I made for the company I first worked for, and the second was a self-published game in VR that unfortunately I released a bit too early, but more on that story on another day. My original plan was to use Unity for this project, and I had actually started to build various systems I knew I would need inside Unity. But this was also around the time that Unity started to change its pricing models and generally made a whole lot of bad decisions. I really didn't want to switch away from Unity, but they'd become so unreliable that I just couldn't pull the trigger on using them as my development tool. What really was the last straw for me was that when I contacted billing to fix some minor credit card issues that I was having with the expiration date, they replied back and said that it would take 2 months before they could even respond to me. Don't get me wrong, I still think it's a great tool, but one of my personal goals was to create a business that was sustainable making indie games. And Unity was proving that they weren't reliable, and that they were driven more by profit than the actual needs of the individual developers. Now, if you're still learning game development and those pricing structures don't apply to you, then I would still recommend Unity. It's very forgiving compared to other engines, and there can be a great deal of depth when you need it. There's actually loads of great documentation and tutorials out there. In fact, I've actually made some of my own, and you can check them out in the channel below. I actually will be focusing more on Unreal going forward, but they're there if you want to get some of the basics and play around with the Unity particle system. There's also the Godot engine, but it's not something I've ever used personally. I did a bit of research on it and found that it didn't get to the complexity level I needed for the game I wanted to make. But if you're just starting out, it's definitely something you might want to consider. With Unity being out for me, I only really had one other option, and that was Unreal. I'd used Unreal Engine in my first job, but it had left a really bad impression. It was buggy, crashed a lot, and generally just took a lot more effort to do even the simplest tasks. Being a programmer, I didn't really need the blueprint system, and it felt weird to try to contort my scripting knowledge into a node-based programming system. I also didn't want to switch to the C++ side 100% since it was cumbersome to use and prone to error. Unreal did, however, give you a great deal of flexibility if you had time to implement custom code, and it delivered stunning graphics out of the box, which was a very nice bonus. I did like the AI systems, which were quick to implement and easy to customize, but I was still reluctant to switch over. If you're new to game development and don't have a lot of technical experience, I would both suggest using Unreal and not using Unreal. Let me explain. If you plan to use out-of-the-box features and stick to blueprints, you can get some basic logic going pretty quickly and make some really graphically stunning games. It can be a pain to set up, and you can have all sorts of undocumented problems crop up, but generally, if you use it exactly the way they intend you to use it, then it mostly works okay. If you want to do anything deeper than the surface level blueprints or the basics, it's a sheer cliff straight up as far as the learning curve is concerned, and it's very unforgiving, especially if you start to dive into the C++ side of things. So if you're a glutton for punishment and want to learn a whole lot by diving into the deep end, then this is the path for you. It is unfortunately the path for me, but I do have the advantage of having worked on this engine before at a previous job and learning computers at a time when this kind of undocumented madness was the rule, not the exception. Unity would be a far better choice to get your feet wet and learn the basics of coding and making games, but like anything, I'd recommend you do your own research on both to see which would suit your project and your needs the best. Deciding which engine to use was actually the second step in my process, and wasn't so much a decision as a reaction to Unity's shenanigans. The first step was an idea. For this game, I wanted to use some marketing research I came across to make the decision on which genre to use, to ensure that it reflected the best games that were selling on Steam. If you look at the howtomarketagame.com website, there'll be a link below, and the material that Chris provides, they make a compelling argument to choose games that are both popular and don't have a lot of competition. If your goal is to make a sustainable business creating indie games, then I would suggest doing the same to ensure that there's a market for the game you want to make. If there isn't, you may be able to add a popular genre to your existing idea to increase its appeal on Steam. For example, I have many game ideas, which is why it wasn't really much of a stretch for me to combine one of the ideas I had with a popular genre, which is ultimately why I ended up choosing stealth roguelike. Stealth in itself didn't appear on any genre lists, but roguelikes are very popular, and I felt that both roguelikes and stealths paired well together if the pacing was done right, and I ensured that multiple runs didn't drag out. Pacing is one of the biggest challenges in designing this game, and it's something I'm still working on balancing, but I think I finally found something that's working. The replayability of roguelikes also helped with scope. Since I didn't have to create custom levels, I could randomize and reuse assets to generate levels procedurally. I would still need different themes as you went deeper into the system or into different areas, but I felt that would be easier than creating entire environments of custom assets for each level, and I felt it was easier to manage since I was the one that would have to do all the environmental art. But since my greatest skills are in programming, I felt that would be easier than relying on my skills for art to generate content for each level. So that's why I chose stealth roguelike as the genre, but that still left the story and world that this game would take place in. For that, I drew inspiration from some of my favorite games, movies, and authors. I've always been drawn to sci-fi, and being a programmer, I like the idea of programmers being gods in the Tron movies, for obvious reasons. And aside from the amazing visuals of the original, I really got drawn into the idea that there's an alternate dimension or reality that existed in a computer world. The Matrix was another movie that touched on this theme with hackers and martial arts and gun battles and virtual worlds that you could jack into. It reminded me a lot of the Shadowrun paper and dice role-playing game, which was inspired by authors like William Gibson. I really love Burning Chrome, a collection of short stories written by William Gibson, and I'd recommend it if you'd like to dive deeper into the origins of cyberpunk, or if you just want to read some really cool sci-fi stories. As a side note, if you want to watch an old classic movie that predated Cyberpunk 2077 and was inspired by games like Shadowrun, you'll want to watch Johnny Mnemonic, starring none other than Keanu Reeves. It's kind of a bad movie, but in a good way, and it was back in a time when 320 gigabytes was a mind-blowing amount of data. You'll get that pun later. The classic games on Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, both named Shadowrun, were also based off the paper RPG and were pretty fun to play. I'm thinking I might do a Twitch stream sometime of the playthrough of both the Sega and Super Nintendo versions. Let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd be interested in seeing. So what was I? Yeah, themes. So these were the themes that inspired me. So I decided to make my own spin based off of these themes, where scientists had discovered an alternate dimension that had vast computational power and could house virtual worlds, because it was also found that people could project their consciousness into these spaces. This gave me a great deal of flexibility to craft the world that was best suited for the game, and provided a less hand-wavy excuse as to why people were able to live in a virtual world that didn't require massive supercomputers that spanned hundreds and hundreds of acres. It also gives it an air of mystery to inject interesting plot twists, because in this alternate reality, people won't bring in their biases as to how computers work and what computers in this world are capable of. It's also a bit different than your standard advanced tech or magic as a means to explain the unknown or fantastic, which gives my world a bit of its own unique flair. There's also some interesting things I can do with the story using this theme, but I don't want to get too much into that just yet. With my story and world roughed out, I turned my attention to the gameplay. Originally, I envisioned a top-down game like Metal Gear Solid, with a mini-map in the top corner and vision cones, hiding, sneaking, and gadgets. A quick story about Metal Gear. My first interaction with Metal Gear was actually a Radio Shack magazine in the back. They had some sort of computer, I don't really remember the model, but they also had different pictures of all the different gadgets you could use, like C4 and remote missiles. And your imagination just went wild with all the different things you could possibly do. I went as far as creating the top-down mechanics in Unreal and the movement systems, but no matter how much I tried, I just couldn't find that it factor to make it great. This is when I started to think of the stealth games I enjoyed the most, like Thief 1 and 2, Dishonored, and Middle-earth: Shadows of War. All these games used a third-person model for movement, so I decided to try it by getting a plugin that had both parkour and climbing, and integrating it into my system with a few tweaks. This immediately felt way better to play, and after a little bit more tweaking, it was amazing, and I haven't looked back since. This goes to show that not every design decision is set in stone, and it's a good idea to keep testing different mechanics until you find what's the most fun to play. Because at the end of the day, you want a game that's just fun to play and feels right. My plan when it came to the roguelike elements was to combine the mechanics of two games and expand upon them. For the level design and story, I wanted to use a system similar to Undermine. I liked the way the story unfolded as you descended deeper into the mine by having rooms with event triggers in them that were added to each level as it was generated, depending on where you were in the story. This worked well because it ensured that on each level that was randomly generated, there would always be a story element that was injected depending on the story needs. For the combat and items you find, I was more inspired by Dead Cells. Since Shadowrasa is an action stealth roguelike, I felt that the progression systems in that game were better suited to the gameplay I was trying to achieve. At this point, I haven't fully implemented all the mechanics, so it might evolve as the game develops, similar to the way that the camera and movement system did. But this is the point I'll be starting at. This concludes what I wanted to talk about in this video. In my next video, I'm going to go over some of my tools and setup, and talk about some of the systems I've already started, as well as a few other goodies. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.